In the Unit 2C lesson, we are going to examine the post-war era and the excesses of the 1920s and how those excesses facilitate the Great Depression. During the 1920s, 4 million people moved from farms to cities. As progressive wings in both parties shrink, everyone after the Great War is anxious to return to life as it was before. After a brief recession, America experiences the fastest economic growth rate in history. Inflation is low, incomes are high, technology is transforming every facet of American life. Not to mention that new machines like electric motors, steam turbines, dump trucks, tractors, and other things are transforming the way farms, factories, and every other job in America functions. As Americans enjoy this additional money and stable income, they also begin to want to consume more. We have the birth of what will become known as the American consumer culture. Perhaps what we are most well known for now, extravagant buying, shopping for fun becomes commonplace. By 1929, 60% of American purchases were made on an installment plan. The previous virtues of saving money and only buying what you need has evaporated. No other era of American life has such dramatic changes in day-to-day habits as this era. One of the things that unites American culture after the war is a rise in mass culture. Things like movies, radio, and jazz clubs unite Americans across the country. It allows people in New York to have the same experiences as people in Georgia or Chicago, and all of these things unite America and give us one cultural identity. In addition to common cultural identities, we have additional independence that is fueled by a car culture. In 1920, 8 million cars are registered. By 1929, there were more than 23 million. Cars were no longer just a vehicle to get you around. It was a vehicle of freedom, a vehicle of liberation. Not just drive-in movies, drive-in churches pop up throughout the United States. Sunday afternoon drives become one of the famous hobbies of this 1920s culture. Women in the 1920s start pushing boundaries. One such way is the flapper girl, probably one of the biggest symbols of the flapper era in the 1920s. The reality is most women were not flappers. Flapper girls were young, college-educated women who weren't ready to go into the traditional role of wife and mother, and so they liked to dress up and go to jazz clubs and dance because they could. Many of these women were becoming salaried professionals, deciding they wanted to go into the workforce before having children, but they certainly challenged the traditional norms of the day. If there was ever anything that just quintessentially described the 20s, here's a fun fact. The number of beauty shops went from 5,000 to 40,000. Now, obviously, going to see a hairstylist, a manicurist, or a cosmetician, these aren't things that you have to have. These are not needs. This is absolutely just an indulgent, but it is highlighting that new version of feminism that is fun-loving, that wants to enjoy life before marriage and motherhood, and that is so greatly challenging what have always been traditional norms in the United States. After the Great War, most Americans were weary of Wilson's crusading idealism, and as a result, they are weary of the Democrat Party in general. Republicans are going to dominate the era, mostly because it is peaceful and the economy is booming. Americans love to vote their pocketbooks, and as the 20s roar, so does the Republican Party. Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, followed by Herbert Hoover, the wonder boy who managed the Food and Drug Administration during World War I. All of these men are easily elected, supported, and life in America is easy in the 1920s. One of the areas that all of these men, even though things were good, were still unwilling to progress is racial progress. Segregation is the norm. People are fearful of dealing with the race question because of the KKK, things that happened with Abraham Lincoln, and a variety of other problems related to race. And so for the most part, all of these leaders from Wilson to Hoover are choosing to ignore the race question. One significant step forward under Republican rule is the labor unions that popped up during the Progressive era begin to diminish. Republicans were very pro-business, and as a result of that, labor unions lost some of their power. But as wages are on the rise and jobs are plentiful, there is less for workers to be frustrated about, and so they were less likely to turn to unions in this very profitable era. Under Republicans, taxes are lower, unions are limited, and consumption is soaring. It is good to be in business in the 1920s. But Franklin Roosevelt predicted that the Democrats were never going to win an election again until the economy dissipated into a Great Depression. And is he right? Another transformation during the time is a transformation in black culture. In areas where segregation was less prominent, you had things like the Harlem Renaissance, where black people in cities were hoping to celebrate their independent and unique culture. There were also people that believed, like Marcus Garvey, that African Americans would never be able to really enmesh and fit in American culture. And so he suggested leaving and, removing African Americans from the American empire. But you see these movements, Garveyism, the Harlem Renaissance, and even the Niagara movement, which will turn into the NAACP, which exists today, is focused on ensuring that people have the rights that they have been given under the 13th and 14th Amendments and 15th Amendments. The reality is in the South, this is going to be a long time coming, but the NAACP does begin to make inroads into northern states and press for black equality. Immigration has always been a powerful force shaping American history. This was certainly true between 1860 and 1920. As immigration increases, people are sometimes naturally fearful, and we have nativism, another surge of nativism, as we've talked about before. There are significant groups that push back against anything that is different than Anglo-Saxon power. Three important things to note about this rise in nativism. The Sacco and Vanzetti trial, a very famous trial where two Italian immigrants are arrested and convicted and executed basically with no evidence, simply because they were immigrants. You have the Immigration Act of 1924 that limited immigrants from Europe. America is anxious to return to the pre-war era. We don't want anything to do with Europe and Europe's problems, and we are going to do all we can to press away from that. The KKK is also going to take on new forms. It is no longer just going to be a Southern group intent on terrorizing African Americans. It is going to be anti-Roman Catholic, anti-Jew, anti-immigrant, anti-communist, anything that is not the mainstream. The Scopes trial is another example of this nativism. In 1925, fundamentalists outlaw in Tennessee anything that steps out of that mainstream Anglo-Saxon American ideal. And so in Tennessee, A teacher dares to teach from a Darwinian textbook. He is put on trial. People descend upon this small town in Tennessee, and this becomes a contest between evolution and Christianity, between progressivism and traditionalism. And in this post-war era, you have this giant push of people trying to pull America back into the time before the Great War, when life was easier and more easily understood. Prohibition at this same time fails. It proved to be a colossal failure for many of the reasons that we already discussed. It was too difficult to enforce. Most Americans didn't respect it. Think speed limit, right? No one considers you a criminal if you are going 30 in a 25. That is how people viewed this. The loss of liquor taxes cost the government a great deal of money and in taxes. And because it had waited so long to take effect and it didn't actually outlaw the consumption, there were lots of people that found lots of creative ways to skirt around this law, so it was repealed. One of the biggest problems with Prohibition was that it rewarded criminals. People like Al Capone in the 20s, through bootleg liquor, are able to soar to very proud and powerful points of influence. In 1927, his Chicago-based bootlegging, prostitution, and gambling empire brought him in $60 million. That is in 1927 dollars. That's a lot. And he is able to come to this simply because of the laws around Prohibition. Also, in the post-war era, we have a new push for isolationism and ocean privilege. We didn't want to join the League of Nations. We didn't want to deal with immigration. We intend to stay isolated across the Atlantic. We encourage France to pay, Germany to pay France their war debts. We want to stay out of their business, and we refuse to do anything to help Germany rebuild its economy. We will pay for that when Hitler uses that as a way to get Germans invested in pursuing a war with Western nations. And finally, disarmament. Disarmament after the war was when leaders agreed that everyone was going to lower the size of their military, their weapons, in an attempt to minimize war. If you don't have guns, if you don't have the military, how can you fight? The problem with things like disarmament is the countries that followed it, the United States, Great Britain, and France, were not threats to world peace at the time. Hitler has no intention of following disarmament, and it's one of the first things he does when he comes to power is start pulling out of the League of Nations and building up the arsenal of Germany. The U.S., Britain, Japan, France, and Italy all signed on to this to pursue disarmament, but as soon as in Japan and Italy, and then also Germany, these very rogue and dangerous leaders come to power, disarmament is largely abandoned. All in all, life in the post-war era in the 1920s in America was good. People were happy spending money, but we know that the excesses of this era are going to come to a screeching halt with the Great Depression that is imminent in 1929.